Before we dive into this spine-chilling story, please subscribe for more daily creepy horror stories. So, I'm Laura, 29, and I live in this quiet suburban neighborhood with my 2-year-old daughter, Emma. My husband, James, works out of state as an engineer, so it's just me and Emma during the week. Honestly, I'm kind of used to it by now. The quiet, the routine, the same old thing every day. But every once in a while, I just need a change of pace, a little escape. That's why last Saturday I decided we were going to the mall. It wasn't anything fancy. I didn't even have a list of things I needed to buy. I just figured I'd walk around, maybe grab a coffee, let Emma burn off some energy. She's a ball of energy, so that's always a good idea. We got there in the early afternoon. The mall wasn't too crowded, which was perfect. Emma was in the stroller, chatting away to herself like she always does, pointing at stuff, excited by absolutely everything. I couldn't stop smiling at how cute she was. She still hasn't said her first clear word. I was waiting for it, that moment where she looks up at me and says something that actually makes sense. Anyway, we were just strolling through the aisles, and then I passed the toy section. I don't usually stop there. I'm not the type to buy toys unless Emma really needs something, but something caught my eye. I turned around to see what it was, and that's when I saw it. A doll. At first, I thought it was just another generic, lifeless toy, but there was something about it. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple doll, dressed in a little dress with lacy trim, but it had this curly brown hair. I don't know why, but I stopped in my tracks. It was almost like I knew this doll, like it was familiar in some way. I leaned in closer to get a better look, and that's when I saw the birthmark. It had a faint little mark on its cheek, right where Emma's birthmark is. My heart kind of skipped. It was subtle, but it was there. I stood there for a second, staring at it, thinking, that's just a coincidence. It can't be. But I couldn't shake the feeling. It felt a little off. But I told myself I was overthinking it. Dolls look like their owners all the time, right? I shook my head and smiled. I'm just being silly, I muttered to myself. And I moved on, but I couldn't help but glance back at it one more time. Emma, of course, noticed the doll right away. She was sitting up in her stroller, squirming and reaching for anything in sight. When she spotted the doll, she immediately grabbed for it with both hands, giggling. She wasn't saying much yet, but her face lit up like she'd found something important. Well, I guess it's meant to be, I said, chuckling as I bent down to grab it. The doll was cheap, and I thought, why not? It'll keep her entertained while James is away. Emma was always so curious, and I figured she'd enjoy having a new toy to play with. Maybe it would even help her with talking. Dolls are supposed to be good for that, right? I tucked the doll into the stroller next to her, and Emma immediately hugged it to her chest, smiling up at me. She didn't say much, but her little hands clutching it tightly told me everything I needed to know. Mimi, I whispered, looking at the doll. Mimi, that's what we'll call you. I watched Emma cuddle the doll, thinking it was a goodbye after all. Little did I know, that doll Mimi was about to take us on a journey I never could have imagined. The first few days after Mimi came home felt normal, for the most part. Emma absolutely adored the doll. She carried it everywhere, at breakfast, during walks, even to the bathroom. It was sweet, really. I didn't think much of it. After all, it was just a doll. Emma seemed to have a little connection with it, and I figured it'd be a harmless distraction while James was away on business. But after a few days, things started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It wasn't anything major, just little things. Like, I'd catch Emma staring at Mimi for way too long, her face almost blank. Or sometimes, I'd find the doll in different places than where I left it. I'd put it on the shelf, and the next morning, it'd be sitting on the couch, facing the window. I thought maybe I was just being forgetful, but something about it unsettled me. One evening, after I tucked Emma in and made sure she was asleep, I settled into my usual routine. I cleaned up the kitchen, did some light housework, and checked my phone. Nothing new. The house was quiet, and I was just about to plop down on the couch with a book when something caught my eye. Mimi. I had placed her on the shelf earlier that day, facing forward, but now she was leaning forward like she was watching me. I paused, staring at her for a second. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It's nothing, I told myself. Just my imagination. But as I walked over to put her back in her original position, I noticed something. Something I hadn't seen before. As my fingers brushed against the fabric, I noticed faint stitching on the inside. It wasn't just any stitching. It was meticulous, almost deliberate. I leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. That's when I saw it. The stitching shimmered under the moonlight, like it was catching the light in a way it shouldn't have been. My heart started to race, and I felt this sudden, inexplicable chill. The stitching began to form words, appearing slowly in silver thread, like it was being written in real time. As I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the faint stitching on the inside of Mimi's fabric, something strange happened. The moonlight from the window hit the doll just right, casting a soft glow on the stitching. It wasn't just that the thread shimmered, it almost glowed in the pale light, like it was reflecting or absorbing the moonlight in a way normal fabric wouldn't. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. The stitches started to form something. Words. Slowly, they appeared as if they were being written in real time, the silver thread twisting and turning into readable text, one letter at a time. Each word shimmered brighter with the next, almost like the moonlight itself was bringing the message to life. I froze. The words weren't just stitched into the fabric. They seemed to emerge from it, as though the fabric had been hiding them all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The fact that only the moonlight seemed to make them visible made my stomach tighten. It felt like they were meant to be seen under those exact conditions, nothing ordinary about it. It was a surreal moment. The rules were right there, in front of me, but I couldn't understand how they'd even gotten there, or why I could only see them now. It didn't make sense, and that's what made it all the more terrifying. I stood frozen, staring at the words that seemed to glow in the dark. Rules. I blinked. I thought I was dreaming, but I wasn't. The rules were right there in front of me, stitched into the doll's fabric like a warning. Rule 1. Never leave me facing the wall. Rule 2. Do not let me stand in front of a mirror after midnight. Rule 3. Never let me hold your child's toy. Rule 4. If I fall over on my own, pick me up and apologize immediately. Rule 5. Do not let me stay in the same spot for more than 24 hours. Rule 6. If I whisper, "It's time," do not answer. I blinked again, trying to process what I was seeing. I laughed nervously, feeling ridiculous. "Okay, this is some kind of prank, right?" I whispered to myself. But then I thought about it for a second. Who would put that kind of thing in a doll? And why? I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just some weird coincidence. Maybe some kind of gimmick? A marketing thing to make the doll stand out? But still, my stomach twisted in a way I couldn't ignore. I didn't know what to make of it, but a small part of me was already unsettled. Who does that? Who stitches rules into a doll's fabric? So the next day, I woke up and I couldn't stop thinking about those rules. I made sure to follow the first one. Never leave me facing the wall. I know it sounds ridiculous, but after seeing those weird words appear on the doll, I wasn't going to take any chances. I even thought about just tossing the thing, but then I looked at Emma. She loved Mimi, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. It seemed silly, but I just couldn't. Anyway, everything seemed fine for most of the morning. I was busy making lunch when I noticed something off. I didn't even expect it, but when I looked up at the shelf, Mimi wasn't there. I blinked a couple of times thinking I was seeing things, but no, she was gone. I quickly checked Emma's room, thinking maybe she'd grabbed it, but nope. Emma was in her crib, fast asleep, her stuffed animal clutched tightly in her little hands. So, where was Mimi? I walked around the living room, and that's when I saw it. There, on the floor, was the doll, sitting up, facing the wall. I felt my heart race. I didn't move her. I swear, I didn't touch her. I picked her up and placed her back on the shelf, trying to shake off the weird feeling crawling up my spine. It just didn't make sense. Then I had this strange thought. I started wondering if something was going on with the doll, like it was mimicking Emma. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out. After I put Mimi back on the shelf, I went back to the kitchen to check on Emma, who was still napping. But then I saw something even stranger. When Emma smiled at me, just a little grin, like she always does, Mimi's face shifted, just a tiny bit. The corners of her mouth seemed to pull up, almost like she was smiling too. It wasn't huge or obvious, but it was there. It was like the doll's face was trying to copy Emma's expression in real time. I shook my head, thinking, no way, I'm imagining things. But then, when Emma giggled, Mimi's face seemed to twitch again. It wasn't just the mouth this time. The whole expression seemed to change. The doll's eyes, which had always been fixed and empty, looked softer, like they were trying to mimic Emma's joy. It was subtle, but it freaked me out. I can't explain it, but the more I watched, the more I was convinced. The doll was copying Emma. I wasn't crazy. When Emma moved, smiled, giggled, or even looked a certain way, Mimi's expression seemed to shift to match it. It wasn't like it was alive, but it was like it was reacting to Emma, watching her, learning from her. I stood there, frozen, staring at the doll, my pulse racing. I didn't know what to think anymore. Was it just a creepy coincidence, or was something really wrong? I didn't know, but I was starting to feel more and more like I had to keep my eye on this doll. It was just another evening, me folding laundry, Emma playing with her toys on the floor, the usual. I didn't think much of it. But then, as I glanced over at the shelf, my stomach dropped. There, lying face down on the floor, was Mimi. She had tipped over again, her little ceramic face pressed against the hardwood like she'd fallen all on her own. It was a weird feeling, but at first I brushed it off. No big deal, I thought. Maybe Emma knocked it over when she was playing with her toys. But then, like a flash, that rule popped back into my mind. If I fall over on my own, pick me up and apologize immediately. Now, I know it sounds silly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to follow it. I could almost hear the rule echoing in my head, like a whisper I couldn't ignore. It wasn't a big deal, right? It was just a doll. But something about it made my hands tremble as I reached down. I picked Mimi up off the floor, her small, cold body too stiff in my hands. For some reason, I couldn't just set her back on the shelf like I'd done before. My voice came out soft, almost in a whisper, like I was afraid someone or something might hear. "Sorry," I muttered, unsure why I was apologizing to a doll. It just felt like the right thing to do. But as soon as my fingers touched the doll, I felt a strange chill run through me. It was colder than it should have been, like it had absorbed the cold from the room itself. I pulled my hand back slightly, but then, almost instinctively, I placed it back on the shelf. It wasn't that the room was particularly cold. It was just different. Like the doll had somehow soaked up the chill in the air. I stood there for a moment, looking at Mimi sitting perfectly still again. The room felt eerily quiet. Emma was still playing with her toys, completely oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like I had just followed some unspoken command, and it felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt like I was being watched. I shook it off, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. It's just a doll, I thought. Nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore the strange rules anymore. There was something about Mimi that didn't sit right. So when James finally came home that weekend, I knew I had to tell him everything. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, especially with all the weird stuff happening with Mimi. I sat him down and told him how the doll kept moving on its own, how it seemed to follow Emma's every move, and how there were these strange rules that I just couldn't ignore anymore. James, of course, laughed it off. "It's just a doll, Laura. You're letting your imagination run wild," he said, giving me a playful nudge like I was just being overly dramatic. "Come on, it's probably just stress. You've been running around after Emma all week." I honestly wanted to believe him. I really did. But then he kept going, laughing about how I was following these rules and treating them like they were something serious. "You're actually following these rules, Laura? Really? A doll's got you acting like this?" I just stared at him, trying to explain, but the more I talked, the more he made jokes. "Maybe you need a break, huh?" he chuckled. It stung a bit, but I didn't argue. What was the point? He wasn't getting it. I did try to tell him once. One day I tried to throw it away, but it keeps coming back with Emma. I don't even know how it happens. But he just brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal. By Sunday evening, he packed his things, kissed Emma goodbye, and left for work again. And honestly, I felt this knot in my stomach as he walked out. It was like this weight was pressing on me, but he didn't notice. He was fine, just like before. But I wasn't fine. I had this feeling, and it wasn't going away. I wanted to believe James. I really did. I wanted him to be right, and that I was just overthinking it all. But that night, as I tucked Emma into bed, everything changed. I went to check on Mimi, and there she was, sitting back on the shelf like nothing had happened. But there was something different. Her eyes, those glassy, lifeless eyes, they weren't just staring at the wall anymore. They were staring directly at me. And it wasn't like she was just sitting there. It felt like she was waiting for something, like she was watching me. I froze. I couldn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I just stood there, staring back at her. I wanted to shake it off, tell myself I was just imagining things, but it was too real. I could feel her eyes on me like she was waiting for me to do something. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what to think. But standing there, feeling that cold stare, I knew something was terribly wrong, and I couldn't pretend anymore. The next day, I decided to take some photos of Emma and Mimi together. I placed them in front of the mirror, thinking it would be a cute shot. Emma was giggling, holding the doll, and I thought it would make for a nice memory. But as I looked into the reflection, something was off. The doll's reflection didn't match its position. It was slightly turned, as if it was facing Emma, instead of being turned toward the camera like it should have been. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe the lighting was playing tricks on me, I thought. I snapped the photo quickly and moved on with my day, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping over me. But that night, as I was getting Emma ready for bed, I remembered the second rule. Do not let me stand in front of a mirror after midnight. I froze. It was almost midnight. I had just placed Mimi in Emma's crib like usual to keep her company while she drifted off to sleep. But the rule echoed in my mind, and panic began to rise in my chest. I quickly moved the mirror away from the crib, not sure why I was so anxious, but feeling like I couldn't ignore it. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the doll from across the room. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my thoughts were racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was like the air around the crib had thickened, and I felt a weight pressing down on me. Unable to control the growing fear, I grabbed my phone and called James. The ringing felt like it went on forever until he finally picked up. "Hey babe, what's up?" he asked, sounding tired but still calm. "James, I don't know what's happening," I said, my voice shaking. "Mimi, the doll, it's doing things. I can't explain it. The mirror, it doesn't follow the rules. Something's wrong with it. I can't keep ignoring it." There was a long silence on the other end, and I could hear him sigh. "Look, Laura, I know you're scared, but you have to calm down. It's just a doll. It's not real." "No," I interrupted, almost pleading. "James, you don't get it. It's not just a doll. It's like it's alive. It moves. It follows Emma around. And now, the mirror. I don't know what to do." He paused again, and I could tell he was trying to process what I was saying. Finally, he spoke, sounding more serious. Okay. Listen, maybe we should try something. If it's following these weird rules, maybe we need to break them. Try burning it or taking it apart. That might stop it." The suggestion made my stomach drop. The idea of destroying Mimi felt wrong, but I had to try. "All right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try it." I hung up and stood up from the bed, my hands shaking as I walked over to the doll. I grabbed a lighter from the kitchen and tried to set fire to the hem of Mimi's dress. But the moment the flame touched the fabric, it just didn't burn. The fabric didn't even singe. I tried again, and the same thing happened. I tried dismantling the doll, pulling at the seams of her clothes, but the stitches wouldn't budge. It was as if the doll was impervious to any damage. I pulled harder, but the doll stayed intact, not even a scratch on it. Frustrated and scared, I called James again. "I tried. It won't burn. It won't tear. Nothing's working. It's like it's unbreakable." "I'm coming home," James said, his voice firm now. "I'm taking some time off work. I'll stay with you and Emma. We'll figure this out." The promise to find a solution was the only thing that kept me from losing it completely. But deep down, I knew things were getting worse. No matter what we tried, the doll always came back, always sitting in Emma's crib, unscathed, waiting. James had come back to stay with us, and we had been following the rules carefully, even though everything about it felt completely insane. I had hoped that his presence would somehow make things feel normal again, but that didn't happen. If anything, it made everything feel worse, like we were just waiting for the next strange thing to happen. One evening, we were sitting together in the living room. I had Emma on my lap, her tiny hands grabbing at my shirt as she babbled happily. James was lounging on the couch, flipping through his phone, probably trying to ignore the constant tension that hung in the air. The house was quiet, peaceful in its own way, but there was still a lingering unease, like something was about to shift. Suddenly, as I was typing an email, I heard a soft thud from behind me. I turned just in time to see Mimi, the damn doll, fall off the shelf. I blinked. It was like I was seeing things, but no, Mimi was lying face down on the floor. I sighed and glanced over at James. "Can you pick that up?" James gave me a look, still sitting comfortably on the couch. "What, the doll? It's been perfectly placed there for weeks. There's no way it just fell over on its own." "I know, but just pick it up and apologize to it," I said, trying to sound casual, but already feeling the usual unease creeping up. He stared at me for a second, blinking like I'd just asked him to solve a math equation in a foreign language. "Wait, what? You want me to apologize to a doll?" "Yes," I said, my voice growing more impatient as I went back to my work. "Just follow the rule, James. It says that if it falls on its own, you have to pick it up and say sorry. Please." James let out a little laugh, shaking his head. "This is insane, Laura. The doll's just a toy. It fell, that's all. I'm not going to apologize to it." "Just do it, James," I said again, barely looking up from my work. "Say it. Sorry." He groaned dramatically, but when I didn't look up, he reluctantly stood up and walked over to the doll. Fine, fine. Sorry, Mimi. Happy now?" I didn't even bother to look at him. "Thank you." There was a long pause before James mumbled, "This is ridiculous," but I could tell he was a little unnerved. I couldn't blame him. I was starting to feel it again, too. The whole situation was beyond weird. But just as I thought things couldn't get any weirder, that's when it happened. Suddenly the silence was broken by a faint, raspy voice. We both froze. "It's time," Mimi whispered, her voice barely audible yet unmistakably clear. I looked at James, my heart stopping for a moment. Then I quickly shot my hand up, signaling him with a sharp gesture to stay silent. I couldn't even speak. The words from the doll, whispering in that cold, eerie tone, were enough to freeze the blood in my veins. James saw my motion and his eyebrows furrowed in confusion, but I could see he was holding back from speaking. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but I quickly placed a finger to my lips, urging him to stay quiet. I wasn't sure why, but I needed us to stay still, to not break whatever fragile silence had settled in the room. Then, just as we were both trying to process what had just happened, Emma, who had been quietly playing with her toys on the floor, suddenly giggled. It wasn't just any giggle. It was the kind of giggle that made my heart swell with joy. I looked down at her, her tiny eyes beaming up at me, and I felt a surge of love. But then, in an instant, everything changed. Emma formed her first word. "Mom," I froze. I couldn't believe it. My daughter, my little girl, had just said her first word. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth as tears sprang to my eyes. "James, did you hear that? She said her first word. She said Mom." James smiled, his face lighting up with pride. He got up from the couch, walking toward us with a grin. "That's my girl," he said, reaching out to pull both Emma and me into a tight hug. He kissed Emma's forehead, and for a brief moment, everything felt like it was going to be okay. But then, I froze. I looked at Emma's smiling face, her innocence beaming up at me. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as the reality of the situation hit me. The joy I had felt moments ago was replaced by cold, paralyzing fear. The final rule had been broken. If I fall over on my own, pick me up and apologize immediately. Emma's first word, Mom, was the breaking point. I hadn't realized it at first, too caught up in the warmth of the moment, but now the weight of it settled in. The rules, they weren't just silly little things we were following. They were real, they were important, and breaking them had consequences. I pulled away from James, my voice shaking as I whispered, "James, she said it. She broke the rule." James paused, confusion spreading across his face. "What are you talking about? It's just a word. She's just a baby." "No," I said, my voice rising with panic. It's not just a word. It's the rule. You don't understand. She said her first word, and it's It's connected to the doll. James still didn't get it. I could see the skepticism in his eyes. Laura, you're freaking out over nothing. It's just a doll. It's just a word. No, it's not, I said desperately, my eyes wide with fear. It's everything. It's the rules. She said, Mom, and now... My voice trailed off as a cold shiver ran down my spine. I looked at the doll on the shelf, and its glassy eyes seemed to be staring directly at us, as if it had been waiting for this moment. James took a deep breath, clearly trying to calm me down, but the fear in my chest wouldn't subside. I don't know anymore, I muttered, my gaze flicking between Emma, the doll, and James. I don't know how much longer we can keep pretending this is normal. Desperate for answers, James and I began searching online for any information about cursed dolls. I couldn't bear the thought of waiting any longer, not with Emma acting so strangely, and Mimi's behavior becoming more and more unsettling. We sat side by side in the living room, phones in hand, the quiet hum of the house only broken by the occasional click of a link being opened. I have to find something, I muttered to myself, scrolling furiously. James was beside me, equally focused on his phone. After what felt like hours of searching, James finally looked up from his screen with a look I couldn't quite place. Look at this, he said, voice tight. He handed me his phone, and I scanned the page, my heart sinking as I read. I found something. A mention of a doll, like Mimi, he said, his voice trembling slightly. It's cursed. I frowned, barely able to process what I was reading. Cursed, I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. What do you mean by cursed? James's face was pale as he read aloud from the article. It says here that these dolls mimic their owners, steal their essence, and trap them in some kind of mirror-like state. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The way the doll had been moving, mimicking Emma's every move, the way Emma seemed so disconnected. Was it possible? Was Mimi really cursed? What does it say we can do? I asked, feeling the weight of the moment press down on me. James kept reading, his eyes wide with disbelief. It says that the only way to break the curse is to trap the doll in front of its reflection during daylight. The article says the doll will start twitching, and its reflection will twist like it's fighting to escape. I swallowed hard. We have to do it, right? We have no choice. James nodded grimly. We'll do it. We have to try. The urgency in his voice mirrored my own feelings. What else could we do? We'd tried everything else, and Mimi was only growing stronger. Our daughter was starting to change, too. But then, something dawned on me. I hesitated, the rules flashing in my mind like a warning. Wait, I said, biting my lip. There's a rule. Do not let me stand in front of a mirror after midnight. I lowered my voice, almost afraid of even speaking it aloud. What if this breaks the rule? James paused, his face twisting in frustration. Laura, we've already broken one rule. You know that. We don't have another option here. I stared at him, my throat tight. He was right. We had already broken so many rules just by having Mimi in our home. But this felt different. The doll had already been mimicking Emma, and Emma had said her first word, Mom, after breaking the final rule. What if this was the last straw? What if this was the thing that set everything in motion? But there was no time to argue. James was already moving toward the door, his determination clear. We can't keep waiting. It's already too late. We do this now, before. He cut himself off, shaking his head. We can't risk it. We had no choice. I nodded reluctantly. We waited until the first light of dawn crept through the window. The silence of the early morning was thick with anticipation, and the air felt charged like something was about to break. We took the mirror outside into the backyard where the soft dew on the grass caught the first light of the day. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the lawn. I held my breath as James set up the mirror, making sure it stood tall and steady. Then he placed Mimi in front of it. For the first time, I saw the doll's reflection, perfectly still, staring back at its own cold, lifeless eyes. But something felt off. The air seemed to grow heavier, the stillness almost unbearable. James stepped back, his eyes locked on the doll. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched it closely. At first, nothing happened. Then, just barely, I saw a twitch. Mimi's head jerked to the side and my pulse quickened. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as the doll's reflection seemed to shift. I could hardly breathe. Then it started. The reflection twisted, It looked as though Mimi's face was stretching, her mouth opening wider than should have been possible, forming a twisted, grotesque grin. The doll's body jerked again, this time more violently, and the reflection in the mirror contorted and writhed, as if it were alive, no longer a simple reflection, but something more sinister. The screeching noise that followed made my blood run cold. It was an inhuman, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. The doll's movements became erratic, jerking like it was fighting to break free from the glass. I could barely hold myself steady as I watched in horror. James grabbed my arm, his face pale, his voice shaky. "Don't let it move. We can't let it move." But it was already too late. The doll's reflection screeched again, the distorted image stretching even further, its mouth now impossibly wide, as if it was screaming. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the contortion stopped. The doll went still. It was as if the mirror had snapped back to reality, and Mimi was once again perfectly unmoving, her eyes lifeless as ever. I stood there, frozen, my heart racing. We had done it, hadn't we? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Something deeper. The silence that followed felt suffocating, and I didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. The crack of the mirror breaking was so sudden, it made me jump. The sharp sound echoed in the still morning air, and I stared, wide-eyed, at the shards scattered across the grass. The mirror was no longer intact, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe a little easier. But then, something amazing happened. Emma, who had been sitting quietly beside the mirror only moments ago, suddenly turned to me, her face bright with confusion, but she was there, alive and safe. I rushed to her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Emma!" I whispered desperately, lifting her into my arms. I held her tightly, feeling the warmth of her little body against mine. "You're okay. You're okay." She giggled, the sound like a melody in the chaos. But as I looked down at her, I realized that something, everything, had changed. The weight in the air seemed to lift, and for the first time in so long, I felt like I could finally breathe without fear. But then, out of nowhere, a gust of wind picked up, and I saw it. Mimi. The doll that had caused so much terror, the thing that had tormented us for weeks, was crumbling right in front of me. I watched, horrified, as the doll's form disintegrated, turning to dust in the wind. And then, amidst the dust, I heard it. A faint whisper, carried by the breeze. "I'll be back." My blood ran cold. I looked at James, who had been standing by silently, his face pale with shock. We had done everything we could, everything we were told to do, but it still wasn't over. The curse hadn't truly broken. It was just waiting for a chance to return. We thought it was over. We thought we had won. But deep down, I knew that the doll's promise was more than just words. It was a warning. Days passed, and for a while, things seemed normal. Emma went back to her usual routine, but I noticed something strange. She started avoiding mirrors, like she was afraid to look into them. And whenever she saw a doll, her gaze would shift uneasily, as if she knew something we didn't. I kept the shattered remains of Mimi locked away in a box, buried far from our home. I thought we were safe. I thought we had rid ourselves of the curse. But then one night, when I was scrolling through my phone in the quiet of the house, something caught my eye. A new photo had appeared in my gallery. I clicked on it, my heart sinking as I saw the image. Mimi. It was sitting in a room that looked eerily familiar, our living room, the one we had tried so hard to escape from. The doll was back, and somehow it knew where we were. I felt a chill run through me as I stared at the photo. The curse hadn't ended. It was just beginning again. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe for more creepy tales. If you'd like to support the channel, consider buying me a coffee on Ko-Fi. Every bit helps. Links in the description.